Written and published by another legendary scholar from Guinea's Walter Rodney, the essay of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was written and published in 1972. The essay is a very strong discourse that turns its attention mainly to the economy, political effects of slavery and colonization, as opposed to the humanitarian social consequences. The book analyzes themes such as colonization, neo-colonization, slavery, labor, robbery, exploitation, resources, wealth, poverty, corruption, injustice, and much more. In Chapter 1, titled A Historical Backcloth, the chapter focuses on Africa in a historical context, which includes both the Africa of the past, the Africa that was being colonized, and the Africa of the present. Rodney is interested in how the legacy of colonialism has affected Africa's development, and this chapter sets the stage by discussing the different factors that shaped Africa's history, present, and future, like its economy, politics, society, geography, climate, and early civilization. So you could say that it's talking about Africa, both past and present, but with strong emphasis on the past being a crucial factor in shaping the present. In Chapter 2, African Society and the European Impact, Rodney then directs his focus to the societies and social structures within Africa before European contact. This chapter is important because it explains how African societies were organized, how they produced and exchanged goods, how they dealt with conflict and justice essentially. African societies were at first communal and family-centric, with social relations and religion revolving around kinship and ancestors. Family lineages also dominated land, labor, and distribution systems, which have been based totally on kinship ties. Labor was highly valued in African societies, and many of the social structures and laws were designed to encourage people to work and contribute to the good of their community, whether it be hunting, farming, gathering, rituals, ceremonies, and meetings, all were done for the good of the tribe. African societies had complex legal and political systems that were often rooted in pure oral traditions rather than written laws. Even in some cultures, a child could be disciplined by any member of the community, regardless they were their parent or not. It also shows that African societies were not static or backwards as some European colonizers claimed, but were actually complex and quite dynamic. Delving into Chapter 3, titled The Trade Winds Blow, which explores the early history of European trade and colonialism in Africa. In this chapter, Rodney traces the development of the transatlantic slave trade and the subsequent scramble for Africa and the emergence of imperialism in the late 19th century. He shows how these events had devastating effects on the pre-established African societies, disrupting established traditional economic systems, eroding social structures. When it comes to African slavery and colonization, Rodney looks loosely at how the European powers competed for control over African resources and how they justified slavery and colonialism with racist ideologies. The chapter also discusses the impact of the slave trade on African societies, including how it destabilized traditional power structures and led to widespread conflict. But, unlike Alex Haley's classic 1976 book titled Roots, the focus of the chapter is definitely more socio-political than directly depicting the brutalities of the slave trade. Rodney's analysis here is really about examining the economic and political structures that made the slave trade possible and what it led to financially on both sides. Consequences such as kings and chiefs who often sold slaves to European traders in exchange for weapons, which they then used to expand their power and conquer neighboring kingdoms. This led to a lot of internal conflict and power struggles, slaves often being taken from certain areas more than others, leading to a shortage of manpower in those regions and causing economic destruction to those communities and tribes. Chapter 3 addresses the economically exploitative relationship between Europe and Africa before colonialism. Europe's power, in contrast to its trading partners, allowed it to dictate the phases of trade and dominate key change routes. The growth of Europe's capitalist market also created a dependence in Africa, which relied on what Europe was organized to purchase and sell. The slave business flourished in this length due to the fact that Europeans used almost free labor to enhance the American infrastructure. Slavery used to be so worthwhile that Europeans engaged in the practice for centuries. Chapter 4 Industrialization and Imperialism. Here, Rodney shifts gears and illustrates how European industrialization and colonialism in Africa were closely intertwined. In short, he's arguing that African occupation was not about civilizing or modernizing Africa, but rather about exploiting it for a wider European business profit. He shows how European countries used Africa's natural resources like gold, diamonds, cocoa, ivory, and rubber to fuel their industries in the 20th century, and how they used their technological and military superiority to maintain control over African territories. The development hole allowed Europe to dominate Africa politically and geographically, thanks to their new advances in weaponry that enabled European powers to collect extra land and resources. In the 19th century, however, in the later story of Europe's exploitation of Africa in the duration of colonialism, as Europeans seized all aspects of African commerce almost entirely, protected markets began to benefit European producers at Africa's expense, reinforcing the unequal nature of exchange between the continents of underpriced or even free raw materials. In addition to booming Europe's monetary development, Africa even provided troopers to combat in Europe and Asia for the duration of World War II. In Chapter 5, titled The Colonial Economy, Rodney goes deeper into the economic impact of colonialism on Africa. This chapter focuses on how European countries structured African economy to serve European interests rather than the needs of African people. He shows how European companies monopolized African resources and labor, imposed unfair taxes on African producers, and used African countries as cheap sources of raw materials and labor for European industries. This is not only hindered by African economic development, but also kept African countries dependent on Europe even after colonialism supposedly ended. He exemplifies European players such as King Leopold II of Belgium, who was notorious for his brutal rule over the Congo Free State, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, which he treated as his personal chiefdom. He used local leaders as puppets to help him exploit the country's ivory, rubber, and labor between 1885 and 1908. In this colonial socio-political economy, the burden of taxation fell heavily on the African population, particularly farmers and peasants of Congo. The colonial authorities imposed various taxes on African people, like a head tax, a hand tax, or a forced labor tax, which had to be paid in cash, labor, or agricultural produce. This caused a lot of suffering for people because they often didn't have enough money to pay these taxes, which forced them to sell their crops, livestock, or even their free labor to European companies. Colonial authorities designed this economy to favor European business, while making it basically impossible for African people to use their own ancestral resources to start something significant. African businesses faced severe restrictions on what goods and services they could sell. So African entrepreneurs were essentially kept out of the game in their own court. This was a deliberate strategy by the colonial powers because they wanted to keep African people dependent on them and make sure they didn't become a political or economic threat. The only black leaders that were allowed in important positions were the ones that listened to every whim of the colonizers, while their own people suffered. Rodney dubs the corporate bourgeoisie In Chapter 6, the final chapter, titled Towards a United States of Africa, comes a call for African unity and development. Despite sustained efforts to preserve its colonies, Europe started out withdrawing from Africa in the 1950s. Violence, political turmoil, and large unrest pressured Europe to hand over Africa its independence from the 50s. Now, whether Africa can achieve complete self-sufficiency is a complicated question. He is calling for African countries to work together and more closely, like a community of nations, to advance the interests of all African people as the only way for Africa to resist continued exploitation and achieve real independence. He also stresses the importance of African people taking charge of their own development and building their own economies based on utilizing African resources and labor. This could be done through regional cooperation like the African Union or others by creating transparently shared economic and political institutions. It is certainly possible to see a future where African countries become more economically and politically integrated, with strong local industries, self-sufficient food production, and robust trade networks within the continent. However, there must be no corruption, and there should be a fair, transparent government that appoints people by merit and not nepotism.
If you want to see more doodle summaries of classic African books like this, please let us know any books we can do by sharing your comments and ideas below. You can also contact this number +26378220767 or +2637121507174 to be entered in our new literature group club. For more enlightening material about African literature, old and new for your college studies. So if you loved watching MEMC Africa and want to see more, please do not hesitate to press like and subscribe. So until we meet next time, thanks for watching MEMC Doodle Summaries. Thank you.